February 14, 1943. Kasserine Pass, Tunisia. Obergefreiter Hans Müller crouched behind a burning Sherman tank, watching American infantry scatter across the rocky hills like wheat before a scythe. He'd been right. They were soft, undisciplined, playing at war while professionals did the killing. He allowed himself a grim smile as another panzer rolled past, crushing abandoned equipment beneath its treads. The Americans were running, just as he'd predicted they would. The air smelled of cordite and diesel. Sand clung to everything, uniforms, weapons, the backs of throats. Müller had fired his MG-34 until the barrel glowed red, had watched men fall, had seen the tide of battle turn exactly as his officers said it would. The Americans couldn't fight, couldn't organize, couldn't withstand professional soldiers who'd survived 2 years of desert warfare against the British. It was almost disappointing how easily they broke, almost. But 18 months later, Müller would crouch in a different bunker, overlooking a different beach, and realize with absolute certainty that everything he believed had been catastrophically wrong. The German soldiers of the Afrika Korps had earned their confidence. They were veterans in every sense, hardened by furnace heat and freezing nights, by sandstorms that turned day into darkness, by battles fought across terrain so vast a single mistake meant death. They'd pushed the British back across Libya. They'd come within 60 miles of the Suez Canal. They'd mastered the brutal calculus of desert tank warfare, where speed and positioning mattered more than armor thickness. These men had fought under Erwin Rommel himself, the Desert Fox, and they'd learned to win. When American forces landed in Morocco and Algeria in November 1942 as part of Operation Torch, the reaction in German ranks ranged from amusement to outright contempt. One corporal from the 5th 10th Panzer Division wrote home with typical bluntness, "We fought the Amos a few days ago and destroyed over 90 of their tanks. We will blow them and all their rabble to perdition." The dismissiveness wasn't merely arrogance. It was doctrine, reinforced by years of propaganda that portrayed America as a nation of weaklings, racially mixed, money-obsessed, incapable of producing real warriors. Before we continue this story, if you're finding this perspective compelling, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It truly helps us bring more of these untold stories to light. And leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, whether you're after years of facing the methodical British, they found Americans disorganized and easily panicked. The problems were real. American units were scattered across 30 miles of front without adequate coordination. Some soldiers had arrived at the front only days before, many having never completed basic training. One regiment received its first shipment of bazookas on February 12th and had to learn how to use them against actual German armor 2 days later. Major General Lloyd Fredendall had positioned his forces in ways that invited disaster, dispersed, fragmented, unable to support one another. When the German attack came, American formations were defeated in detail, one piece at a time. Rommel studied the American positions and identified what he called fundamental weaknesses in their tactical thinking. The Americans, he believed, were years away from competence. German soldiers shared this assessment completely. The enemy was soft. The enemy couldn't fight. The enemy would break. Then something unexpected happened. On the 4th day of battle, American resistance stiffened. Artillery fire that had been sporadic suddenly became devastatingly accurate. Infantry units that had broken under initial assault reformed and counterattacked. The withdrawal Rommel expected to become a rout instead became an organized fighting retreat. By February 22nd, Rommel made a decision that surprised his own staff. He ordered withdrawal. Not because he'd been defeated, but because the Americans were no longer behaving like beaten men. In his personal papers, Rommel recorded a revised assessment that would prove prophetic. The tactical conduct of the enemy's defense had been first class. They had recovered very quickly after the first shock, and had soon succeeded in damming up our advance. Recovered very quickly. Those 3 words would define the American military experience for the rest of the war. What German commanders couldn't see was the machinery already grinding into motion behind American lines. Within weeks, General Fredendall was relieved and replaced by George S. Patton. Omar Bradley came in as assistant corps commander. The entire command structure was reorganized. More importantly, the Americans learned. Officers analyzed what had gone wrong and implemented corrections immediately. Units were consolidated, Training intensified. Communication procedures were overhauled. Artillery coordination became a priority. The speed shocked German commanders who expected Americans to need months digesting their lessons. Instead, improvements were visible within weeks. At El Getter in late March 1943, just 5 weeks after Kasserine, American forces faced another German attack. This time they held. American artillery shattered German armor columns. Infantry stood its ground. The Germans withdrew, having accomplished nothing. This pattern would define everything that followed. Unlike armies built on rigid doctrine, Americans proved willing to discard methods that didn't work and adopt new ones that did. They learned from the British. They learned from the Germans. Most importantly, they learned from their mistakes, and they learned fast. Hans Müller didn't know it yet, but the enemy he'd dismissed at Kasserine was evolving into something entirely different. Something that would force him and every German soldier to reconsider everything they believed about the men they were fighting. By May 13, 1943, the remnants of the Afrika Korps surrendered along with over 260,000 Axis troops. It was Germany's second catastrophe after Stalingrad. Among the prisoners were many veterans who'd mocked American soldiers just 3 months earlier. But the full implications wouldn't become clear until the summer of 1944, until Normandy. Until men like Hans Müller saw with their own eyes what American industrial power and determination could actually accomplish. June 6, 1944, 0630 hours. Whiterstands Nest, 62, Omaha Beach. Müller crouched inside the concrete bunker, hands wrapped around the grips of his MG-42 machine gun. Through the firing slit, he watched the English Channel fill with ships, hundreds, then thousands. Morning mist clung to the water. Waves broke against beach obstacles his unit had spent months positioning. He knew every meter of sand below, every kill zone his officers had plotted. The bunker shook as naval shells hammered the Atlantic wall. Dust fell from concrete overhead. The noise was beyond description, a physical force that pressed against eardrums and chest cavity. Müller had been told the fortifications were impregnable. He'd been told the invasion would be stopped on the beaches, not in the villages or hedgerows. Field Marshal Rommel himself had said the first 24 hours would be decisive. Then the landing craft appeared through the fog. Müller opened fire. The MG-42 roared at 1,200 rounds per minute. So fast individual shots blurred into continuous sound. Below, American soldiers had to cross several hundred meters of open sand exposed to his guns. No cover, no concealment. Just sand and water and men dying with nowhere to hide. He fired until his hands blistered. Went through barrel after barrel as they overheated. Fired until the smell of burnt propellant filled the bunker, and his ears rang and his vision blurred. He fired until he ran out of machine gun ammunition and switched to a rifle. He watched wave after wave of Americans fall, pile up at the waterline, get moved by the incoming tide. And he watched them keep coming. This was the detail German soldiers across Normandy reported with mixture of disbelief and horror. The Americans did not stop. Landing craft were destroyed and more appeared. Men were cut down and more ran forward. Entire units were annihilated and fresh units landed to continue the assault. It defied logic. It defied everything Müller had been taught about breaking an enemy's will. A German wireless operator near Müller's position later described that morning. In the night, the air was full of innumerable planes. We thought, what are they demolishing tonight? But then it started. One message followed another. Parachutists here, gliders there, landing craft approaching. In the morning, a huge naval force was sighted. That was the last report before observation posts were overwhelmed. When this soldier was eventually captured and saw the scale of Allied assembly, his reaction summarized what many Germans felt. At first I was rather depressed. I, an old soldier, a prisoner after a few hours. But when I saw the material behind the enemy front, I could only say, old man, how lucky you have been. He was more right than he knew. Within 48 hours, over 130,000 troops came ashore. Within a week, over 300,000. The Allies constructed artificial harbors, mulberries from prefabricated components. They created ports where no ports existed. German officers who'd studied the impossibility of supplying forces across open beaches now watched the impossible happening. The contrast with German logistics was devastating. The Wehrmacht still relied heavily on horses for transport. German motor pools were cobbled together messes of German, Italian, captured French, and captured British vehicles, each requiring different spare parts, chronically unavailable. German soldiers often went hungry while Americans seemed to have unlimited everything. Miller himself witnessed this abundance firsthand when his position was finally overrun on June 8th. American soldiers offered him cigarettes, chocolate, water. The casual generosity from men who'd just been trying to kill him was disorienting. More disorienting was realizing these men represented something he couldn't comprehend: a nation. One German asked why he surrendered, readily gave an answer capturing the transformed view. The Germans should have thought of some things before they began the war, particularly before attacking the Russians. But when given a choice between captors, I was glad to surrender to the Americans. Hans Muller spent 18 months in a POW camp in Mississippi. He worked on farms, learned English, ate better than he had since before the war. The treatment defied everything he'd been told. Instead of brutality, he found ice cream and relative comfort. Instead of forced labor and starvation, he found work paying 80 cents daily and abundant food. There were over 400 POW camps across the United States, holding nearly 400,000 German prisoners at peak. They became small German communities in the American heartland. Prisoners produced newspapers, organized orchestras, played soccer. Some American farmers relied on German labor, developing genuine respect for their work ethic. This treatment created powerful impressions persisting long after war. German veterans who'd fought Americans often spoke with respect that surprised younger generations. They'd expected monsters and found human beings. Expected barbarity and found strange combination of overwhelming violence in battle and genuine decency in victory. The transformation in how German soldiers viewed Americans between 1943 and 1945 was complete. It moved from dismissal to respect to something approaching awe. At Kasserine, veterans expected quick victory against soft amateurs. By the Bulge's end, they'd learned Americans could absorb catastrophic setbacks and emerge stronger. They'd seen industrial capacity supplying endless replacements. They'd experienced artillery and air power so overwhelming that individual courage became irrelevant. But perhaps the most important lesson was also most surprising. The enemy they'd been taught to despise as weak proved not only militarily formidable, but remarkably humane in victory. In 2001, German historian Sienke Neitzel discovered thousands of pages of secretly recorded conversations between German posts in British and American archives. During the war, intelligence had bugged camps with hidden microphones. The recordings captured German soldiers talking freely, leaving conversations private. In those recordings, Germans discussed Americans with frankness impossible in official channels. They talked about overwhelming firepower, relentless aggression, and repeatedly expressed grudging respect for an enemy they'd expected to despise. One recorded conversation captured the evolution. A veteran explained to newer prisoner that Americans weren't what propaganda promised. Not soft, not cowardly. They combined overwhelming material resources with combat aggressiveness, catching Germans off guard. The German experience offers lessons extending beyond military history, about the danger of underestimating enemies based on cultural assumptions, about the gap between propaganda and reality, about how quickly confident content transforms into fearful respect when confronted with contradicting evidence. The Americans learned faster than Germans expected, adapted more readily, absorbed casualties that would have broken other armies, and kept fighting. Brought industrial resources to bear on a scale making German efforts look like cottage industries. By 1945, the Wehrmacht had learned to fear the enemy they'd once mocked. Not because American soldiers were individually superior, though many proved excellent, but because the American system created a fighting force that couldn't be stopped. When guns fell silent in May 1945, over 1 million American soldiers stood on German soil. They'd crossed an ocean, broken through the Atlantic Wall, fought through hedgerows and forests and mountains, and defeated an enemy who'd conquered most of a continent. The journey from Kasserine to Berlin took just over 2 years. In that time, the American army transformed from inexperienced force that could be rooted into a juggernaut crushing everything in its path. Germans watched this transformation, were on the receiving end, and learned painful lessons about underestimating enemies. Hans Muller returned to Lower Saxony in 1946. He resumed farming, married, raised children. But he never forgot what he'd learned. The enemy he'd mocked at Kasserine had proven something far more formidable than he'd imagined. Not just in material or firepower, but in that distinctly American combination of adaptability, determination, and surprising humanity. That's the lesson emerging from the German experience. Perceptions formed in ignorance persist only until they collide with reality. And when that collision occurs, the awakening is brutal, final, and irreversible.